Hello, everybody. This is the BG, and today we're going to talk about how to make sausage, specifically Polish sausage. This is something that I learned about 8 years ago from an amazing gentleman named Bob Borkowski who used to live in Old North Dayton. This is something that had been a part of every single major celebration of my life, and I never knew as a kid where it came from. It was this omnipresent sausage that was at every major food event. It was only until I got older that I realized that it was a guy making it, in North Dayton. It wasn't from a store. When his wife passed away, he had stopped making it. Our family freaks out because it was something that was always around. And so we had tried to go to, different people that were making it in North Dayton. Nothing was working. Nothing tasted anywhere near the same. We were running out of options, and I had suggested, well, I'd like to learn how to make it. Called him on the phone. He didn't want to talk about it. 1 year goes by, 2 years go by. We're not getting, anything close to the quality of the sausage, from other people. And so by year 3, I said, I'm just going to go to his house and actually just effectively beg him to teach me how to make it. And so I showed up one day and said, I'm Mary's grandson. You're gonna explain how to make this sausage to us because it's super important to our family. Invited me in, sat down and talked for, a long time. Super nice guy, amazing, lived an amazing life, was actually a Major League Baseball player when he was younger, and very interesting to talk to. But, at that time, he was entering the early stage of macular degeneration. And then the fact that he and his wife had always made it together, the fact that she had passed, he didn't want to do it anymore because of that. After my begging, he finally agreed to it. I said, you don't need to do anything. You just need to talk me through it. I will do all the buying of things, the setup, the cleanup, everything. So he finally agreed to that. And I had invited him over the following week and sat him down in my garage, and he just stepped me through the process. It took a couple hours to make the first round, and I'm glad that I had firsthand knowledge of how to do it because what he was doing was different than, as I've known now, other standard sausage making methods as far as the grind size and the seasoning and things like that. That uniqueness is what made it special to our family, the flavor and the texture and things like that. And so I was glad that he was able to explain it to me. It took me about a year to understand actually how to make it really well. A lot of practice involved in it. Sausage making is certainly a difficult thing to pick up. The equipment, you have to have a lot of equipment to do it. It's just something that I knew that we would be fine with because our family, wanted to have access to this type of thing for years to come. And so I've taken over the mantle of that job. But now we have a large group of friends that like making it together. Instead of just making Polish sausage, I make lots of different varieties of sausage that we'll get into in other videos. But I wanted to start out with this one because this is acting as a tribute to a gentleman that inspired me to learn how to do these things. It started with just sausage, but then it went on to I wanted to learn how to make bacon and ham and actually how to break down whole animals. And so it really just opened up an entire wing of doing charcuterie in my life that I never expected to do. And I'm glad that I learned how to do this because being able to talk to farmers and buy whole animals, knowing where they came from, knowing the quality of life that they had is just a much better way to be in this life. I'd like that my kids are learning how to do this. And so this video is a tribute to Bob Borkowski and his family for, inspiring all of us to have better food in our life.
Okay, so first let's talk about the equipment that you'll need to make sausage. So just a note, we are not sponsored by any of the companies that make these products. We just think they work well. So first, the big ticket items. You'll need a meat grinder and a sausage stuffer, both of which you can learn more about by watching BG's tour of sausage making tools. You'll also need a vacuum sealer, which you can learn about in our vacuum sealing episode. And then there's the smaller items, which include knives and cutting board, disposable gloves, sausage casing, plastic wrap, vacuum sealing bags, a mixing bowl, 1 cup measuring cup, a tablespoon measuring spoon, a whisk, and a rubber scraper, a 4-cup measuring cup, a digital scale, and both large and medium aluminum pans. In terms of ingredients for seasoning, you'll need just 3 components: ground black pepper, granulated garlic powder, not garlic salt, and salt.
So the first step to making sausage is actually cutting the meat. What I have here is, since this is a pork sausage, this is what's called Boston butt. This is the top part of the pork shoulder, and I like it because it has just about the right fat to lean ratio for a meat. What you're looking for is about an 80-20 blend, where you have 80% lean, 20% fat. And if you go leaner than that, if I have a 90-10, then the sausage is going to come out tasting drier and, just not as appetizing. If you go towards like the 70-30 range, it's certainly going to taste better, but then you're running into the problem of, if I tried to grill this or something over an open flame and some of the fat starts leaking out, it's just going to pour fat coming out of it and then catch on fire. And so 80-20 is a wonderful starting point. But to get it ready for the grinder, the only thing you need to do is just cut it in any which way you want into strips that are small enough to actually go through the throat of the grinder. The next step is to actually grind the meat. This brings up the first point of uniqueness for this sausage. Most sausages are ground much more finely than this. This has a 1/2 inch plate on it, so the hole size just beyond the cutter head actually have 1/2 inch holes on it. Most of the sausage that you buy in stores is probably going to be ground at a 3/16 inch plate size, where this one, it's very, very coarse, and that requires you to cook it longer, which then changes the flavor of it. So it's almost like you're making sausage as pulled pork versus just doing a fast grilling or a fast frying of something. But that coarseness, Bob was adamant, made this a very unique product, and I agree with it. I mean, it works out perfectly for making Polish sausage. But there's not much here. The only thing we're doing is just putting it through the throat and letting it be ground. This actually brings up the fact I'm not using a sausage stuffer, or a stuffing thing to get this down the tube. The LEM grinders have this thing called the Big Bite on it, where the helix that makes up the auger that pushes the meat into the cutter head does not have an equal spacing on it. It is as wide as the throat is when you start it, and then it actually gets tighter as you go towards the cutter head, and it actually will suck the meat into the auger, and then it just shoots out. I love all of their products. Everything I have in my meat processing area are all LEM products. It's wonderful stuff, but it's quite simple. We're just grinding the meat at this stage. The next step is, once you get all the meat ground that you want to use, we need to start weighing it into the portions of how much you're going to mix at a time. All my recipes are made for doing 10 pounds at a time, so what we're going to be doing here is just weighing out 10 pounds of meat. I have a postal scale that, the cord allows you to have the display off to the side, makes it easier to read. And then all I'm going to do here is just tear out the aluminum pan and just fill it up with 10 pounds of meat. The next step after weighing out the sausage is to mix the seasoning. Now for this recipe, I am doing this as a water-based seasoning mixture. There are lots of butchers that I've talked to that would never add water to sausage making. They feel like it's something that's wrong. If you actually look at the science of what's going on, if water is not in a recipe like this, then when the sausage is cooked, the emulsification that happens during cooking between the fat and the water doesn't happen, and you will actually get a crumbly sausage if it has no water in the recipe. Putting the water into it, it actually will give you better texture at the end product, and that's why I like using it. The second thing is that it makes it much easier to mix. If you're trying to mix, salt, pepper, and these other dry seasonings in a big wad of meat, it's very difficult to get it consistent. If you have it mixed into water where you can flow into the meat and actually, get in all the nooks and crannies and spread it out faster, it's much easier to get a consistent product at the end of the day. The second thing that makes this recipe special is just how much garlic is actually used in it. That 1 cup of granulated garlic is equivalent to about 300 cloves of garlic. It is a ton of garlic in this. And we actually did experiments on figuring out how much, Bob and his wife were using for this, and we went even past 1 cup. And if you go past 1 cup of garlic powder, it actually just tastes basically metallic. And so 1 cup seemed to be the limit for actually getting this to work correctly. But it is a very, very, very strong sausage. So if you love garlic, this is your sausage. I grew up with it, so I think it actually tastes normal. But anybody that has never had it before, if they like garlic, they like it. If they don't like garlic, it's like kryptonite to them. But for here, the only thing we're doing is adding 2 cups of water to a bowl, and then I have 4 tablespoons of pepper, 4 tablespoons of salt, and then 1 cup of garlic, granulated garlic powder. After you have the seasoning ready, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 10-pound medium-sized pan of meat and dump it into a larger aluminum pan to make it easier to mix. And then I'm going to pour the seasoning over top of that meat, spread it out as you're pouring, and then use a spatula to actually get everything out of that bowl. If the, depending upon what the seasoning is for the sausage, some of the salt might want to settle at the bottom of the bowl. And so making sure you scrape it all out, you're making sure that you get all that salt out. For any of these recipes, the most important thing to actually put in that meat is the salt. If there is not enough salt in the recipe, it's just not going to taste right. And so if you just simply pour out the bowl and leave the residue on the bottom of it, you might be losing out on quite a bit of the salt in the recipe. But after you pour it into the pan, you are going to, as quickly as you can, start folding it together. You have to, move left to right, top to bottom, making sure that you're getting the bottom to the top and the sides all folded into each other. With the water in here and the meat, you have only a couple minutes before the mixing kind of seizes up on you. When it's ground so coarsely for the Polish one, you actually have a little bit more working time, but what you'll see on the other videos when we're talking about other types of sausage is that this free mix time of where the meat actually moves around pretty easily is rather short, as the grind size gets finer. But for here, you're just making sure you're getting that seasoning everywhere on the mixture, and so it's just doing a good job of folding it and making sure, especially in the very center of the pan on the bottom, you keep picking it up to make sure that you're not missing anything there. The next step for making sausage is, now that I have all the meat mixed together, I actually need to get it stuffed in casing. So for this, what you're doing is actually getting the piston all the way up on the sausage stuffer to get the canister out. And then I'm going to fill up that canister, making sure that I try to get as little air in the mixture as possible. So you're going to be working in small, handfuls of meat, and then actually pressing them into the canister, and then making sure that you're knocking out any of those air pockets as you keep packing each handful of meat in there. After you get all the meat in the canister, you're going to actually wheel the piston down until you get just a touch of meat to come out of the tube, just like I have. This makes it easier if there is a rounded tip on the end of the stuffing tube for the casing to actually get on to the stuffing tube. The last piece of actually getting this sausage made is to case it. For this type, the Polish, making Polish sausage, we do it in flat coils as a family. You could link it if you wanted to, and I'll show that in another video, but for us, traditionally, this is always done in coils, and I'll show 2 different types, a 1-pound coil and then a 3-pound coil. But what you have to do first is actually get the casing threaded onto the stuffing tube. And so for this, with that little nub of meat coming out of the tip of it, it makes it easier to get the casing on top of it. And what you're doing is you just want to get the casing opened up so it actually goes over the tube. And I also put a towel down underneath the tube because there's going to be a ton of water coming off that bowl that they're soaking in, and you don't want that just getting all over the table. But once the casing actually gets around the tube, what you're feeling for is you'll actually feel every turn of the actual casing. This is natural casing, so this actually was the intestines of a hog, and you'll actually feel the turn happening every 12 or 14 inches on this. And so what my right hand is doing is actually, I'm very slightly adjusting the position of where my hands are on the, going higher on the tube or lower on the tube, to make sure that I'm always keeping the casing in the center of the tube. It's something that you just have to get a feel for over time, but what will happen is that on the turning point of the casing, when it actually twists, throughout the body, it'll get stuck on the tube. And so what you're doing is you're using your hand to move where the center of the casing is, how it's centered on the tube, and then it actually slides on a lot easier. So even though this looks pretty easy when you're watching the video, it's actually something that takes a bit of practice to learn how to get the feel for it, and then having your friends giggle at you the entire time while you're doing it. So now that you got all the casing on the tube, now we can actually start filling it out. And the first thing you're going to do is actually just grab onto the end of the casing, give yourself 3 or 4 inches of casing, and you pull it out, and then hold it tight, and then actually get some of the meat to come out of it. You only need to hold on to the actual casing, at the end of it, to get it filled up a little bit. There's enough friction of the meat once it fills up the casing tube that you don't actually need to worry about the end of it after a couple inches. But this is another thing that you just have to get the feel for over time. I am feeling my right hand is cranking on the sausage stuffer to send the piston down. My left hand is just putting enough friction on the casing at the end of the sausage tube, the casing or the stuffing tube, to keep the right pace of meat coming out. And you're feeling for, you don't want to overstuff the casing. You can certainly feel it after time of, if there's too much meat in the casing, it will actually burst when you cook it. You don't want that to happen. And then if there's too little meat in the casing, well, then you're just kind of wasting the amount of weight, how much the meat weighs per unit length of sausage. But over time you'll get a feel for having the right amount of tension on your hand that's holding the stuffing tube to put the right amount of meat inside of the casing. And for me, it took about a year to get used to doing that. So again, when you're watching me do this, it looks easy, but it's actually one of the hardest things to pick up on. And all the new people that try to do this when we make sausage together, it's funny to watch them attempt it and struggle with it, just like I did when I was learning how to do it. After you fill up a good amount of the casing, now you need to actually start parsing it into either the 1 pound or the 3 pound lengths. And so for this, I have a couple marks on the table. Each one of those marks is about 6 inches apart from each other, and a 6-inch link of using pork casing will give you a 1/4 pound sausage. So putting 4 of those together, I get a 1 pound sausage, and then if I do it 3 more times, or if I do it 3 times total, then I'll get a 3 pound sausage. Another thing you can do is just by the number of twists that actually make up the coil, you can mark out a 3 pound sausage or a 1 pound sausage. And so for this, it's just simply counting off however many 24-inch sections, or 24 times 3 sections to make up these links. The last step is getting it ready for freezing. We make a ton of sausage in the fall, and so for it to last throughout the year, we have to freeze it. And for this type of sausage, we'll be freezing the 3 pound sections or the 1 pound sections. The 3 pound linkages, I am using an 11-inch wide bag, and then for the 1 pound sections, I'm using an 8-inch wide bag. So if you go back to our vacuum sealing video, you can talk about actually how to make the bags and how to seal them. But for here, this is the most difficult part. Since these aren't links, these are coils, it's certainly more difficult to actually get it in the package. What you have to do is just try to pick up the coil from the center and the edge to actually kind of hold it together, slide it into the bag, and once you get it inside, then you straighten the coil back out again to get it flat and looking pretty. But that's it. It's getting the coil made, put it in the bag, getting it straightened out, and then vacuum sealing it. But there you go. That is the finished product. Beautiful looking 3 pound coil ready for the freezer. And you can do the same thing for the 1 pound coils, same operation. There you go, everybody. That is how you make Polish sausage. Take some time out in your day to appreciate all the people that have meant something special to you through your life. And so this video is dedicated to Bob Borkowski. He was an amazing guy. He passed away a couple years ago, and unfortunately, I can't thank him for how much he has actually changed my life for what he's taught me. All I can say is just keep it square, everybody. This is the BG.
Thanks for watching today. Be sure you also check out our other videos on sausage making, including a tour of the tools for sausage making and how to clean sausage casing. Coming up, it's Italian time. We'll share our recipe and tips for making amazing Italian sausage. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get notifications, and thanks again for joining us on Our Final Freezer.
Sausage. Sausage. How to make sausage. How to make sausage.